let's start with like a quick introduction to what an effective birth plan is, and kind of like set a good foundation for ourselves. So, first of all, a good effective birth plan is 1 page in length. Your provider is probably going to miss things if you have bringing 5 or 10 pages. Even 2 pages is hard. Like they just won't flip it over and read the other side. So, we want to make sure it's really concise. And it also conveys flexibility. So these are preferences, not demands. We're trying to avoid coming into your birth setting with like a combative kind of vibe, if you will, and just really coming understanding that birth, preferences may change as you go, and it's okay to have a plan A and B and C, and just kind of really understanding all of the options that are available to you so that you can make an informed decision. Feel free to use bullet points and bold typefaces to highlight the most important points that you're trying to convey to your provider. Writing in easy to understand terms in chronological order. So labor, birth, postpartum, and kind of like each of the pieces underneath that, so that it just follows the flow of your birth, the process. Avoid implications of unethical behavior. For example, like I would like to avoid an unnecessary cesarean section. Your doctor would also like to avoid an unnecessary cesarean section, but this can come across like super combative of like feeling like, oh, they think that I'm going to like give them something that they don't want. And so it can put people on their defensive rather than just a collaborative space. So also discuss this with your birth provider ahead of your baby's birthday. If you bring your birth plan to your birth and that's the first time you're bringing it, your preferences are still valid, but the likelihood of you being able to have your preferences heard and actually conveyed effectively is going to be easier said than done if you do that earlier. Let's get into the weeds. I'm going to go ahead and let Victoria take over, and she's going to chat you through the different philosophies and paradigms of childbirth, by Robbie Davis Floyd. And this is really, really helpful. And I hope it's going to help you kind of like distinguish where you kind of fit on the spectrum, and help you kind of understand a little bit more about your preferences as you jump right in. So go ahead, Victoria.
Yeah, thank you. This is a system that I take all of my own clients through, and I'll preface by saying this is not a trick question. So of course, Robbie Davis Lloyd, she is a medical anthropologist. I would imagine she herself has a preference of which one of these paradigms is preferred for her. But also, I think just her explanation of like, here's kind of three big philosophies we see at play, currently in the childbirth and the maternity care world, and just know like this is just explanations. There's no gotcha if you think you fall under one or the other. It really is just helpful to have some nomenclature, some explanations of like how might I be coming to birth for yourself. And as we'll kind of talk to, it's going to be helpful. Think about it for yourself, think about it for your partner if you have one, and then think about your provider. We are going to encourage you to talk to your provider to kind of figure out where they fall. Again, not a trick question. It's just good to know where's everyone coming from and how might we what biases might need to be set aside, what might need to just be acknowledged, checked at the door, and then come to a collaborative agreement. So the first is technocratic. So we're going to think about this as a spectrum. Technocratic is sort of the most extreme to one end. This would be highly oriented towards science. More tech is better than less tech. It's really driven by profit. There is this idea that this kind of has that patriarchally governed institutions. We kind of know that's probably not the best thing, but it's reality, right? If you think about a hospital system, it's very almost like military, right? Doctors write orders for what needs to be done. Like it's very kind of, there's this understanding of like a nurse is at the bottom, a resident's a little above that, an attending is above that, a chief is above that. So again, just the reality. I know some of these words are loaded, I guess I'm saying, but it's also a picture of often how this might work. In parts of it. Successes are found through science, successes, technology makes us successful, and it's usually more technocratic model lends itself more to like the big institutions, right? So your big teaching hospitals, your big network hospitals, it's gonna technocratic model prioritizes those types of facilities. The next, if you kind of think about the spectrum in the middle, the humanistic model is sort of in the middle, and that is humanizing, right? Or as Robbie Davis Floyd says, making relational technomedicine. So the humanistic model says, hey, yeah, we've got all this technocratic, we've got the science, got the tech, that's great, but I'm really interested in seeing you as an individual. I'm really interested in partnering, kind of that sweet sauce of like, we've got all these things, but what do you want to do? And it's going to be more individually responsive, a little more caring and compassionate and commonsensical. Again, whereas by comparison, technocratic is going to be a little more like, well, if we have the science, we're going to use it. If we have the tech, we're going to do it. We're going to trust what the machine says. Maybe not always listen to what your body's telling you. Just we're going to read off, numbers and stats, and that's what we're leaning on the most. Humanistic kind of blends a little bit of those two, and says, well, hey, there's a person here. So how do we kind of keep that human at the center while also using the benefit of like science and tech and whatnot? And then the final, again, on the spectrum, the total other end of technocratic would be holistic. And this is thought of as, alternative modalities, probably more of an eclectic approach, often of their own design. That kind of means that, holistic is going to pull together whatever it thinks is relevant. It's calling on individuals to make lifestyle changes, to like take charge of their health in that sort of way. Like, what's your environment? What's your lifestyle? Eat better, exercise, that sort of thing. Or it may ask individuals to do some more passive actions like prayer, meditation, things like that to get a healthy effect. But holistic is very much the kind of, if it's natural, we'll do it. If it's high science, we're probably not going to be offering that. And that's kind of the bias. So again, there's not really a right or wrong. What's important to know is, where do you fall? What model, do you think best fits your values, your personal healthcare philosophy? When I give this to clients and we have it here, I do put it as a spectrum, and I'll encourage people, put like an imaginary X on this line. Where do you fall? It might be between technocratic and humanistic. It might be between humanistic and holistic, but it's just good to know, again, where you are coming from. And then that's going to tell you, okay, well, I see my own healthcare from this lens. So when I interact with my partner, talking about decisions for our baby, when I interact with my provider, talking about the healthcare steps I want to take, just acknowledging they may have a different angle. And if we can just know where each other's coming from, you can kind of better go through. There might be some, barriers, whether real or imaginary. It can kind of help you take down any barriers if you can just acknowledge your starting point, their starting point, and then, like I said, meet in the middle. Ideally, that's kind of the golden ideal, right?
Yeah, I love the perspective of like seeking first to understand and then to be understood. So as you kind of like, you understand where you kind of fall in the spectrum, and then you are able to share that effectively with those around you. So when you're coming into relationship with providers who are working in more of that like potentially hierarchical kind of patriarchal model of like top down, it allows you to kind of ask them to step out of that like paradigm and into, a circle of care, which is what we've talked about frequently. Victoria and I have had multiple conversations about this, and it's just around how can we, look at everything that's available to us to make the best decisions for like our family and my birth, and ask like the people who are working with us to do the same. 3 examples of a birth plan working in labor positions and movement. And I'm going to let Victoria kind of expound on this again as well.
Yeah, again, like I think that, when you're thinking about a birth plan, coming at it from again, your philosophy, again, in the guide, I highly recommend you guys go click and download that, print it out. I love how, we're prompting you to think of like, what's the most important thing to me? And then how can that ideal be supported no matter what's going on in the birth? So for example, you may say, in my birth plan, movement, position changes is really important to me. I see a lot of parents say like, please match me with a nurse who's really familiar with moving people in labor and would help me do that. Okay, so that's your goal with a birth plan. Let's say you're someone who's planning a birth without the use of pain medication, but then let's say, you've been in labor for 2 days and you change your mind and you think, hey, an epidural sounds really good right now. Does that mean that we don't honor this birth plan, this birth preference you have of positioning and movement. No, not at all. It just means we do that with an epidural. Um, and so again, the birth plan can still work no matter what's going on. Um,
Yeah.
but in the birth, again, it's kind of again like one of those hallmarks of a good, like just a helpful birth plan, is it sort of has these higher level, um, you know, we keep saying preferences, but just these higher level thoughts of like, here's my approach. Like, I think moving my body is really important to help my labor progress, my baby descend. So no matter what's going on, help me move. Um,
Yeah.
that's really helpful, right?
Yeah, I
For
think
your team.
anything that we can do to use our preferences as a way to call people into,
Hmm.
working with us and working alongside us. So, yeah,
Hmm.
if you choose to have an epidural, but it's really important for you to keep moving and to have like changes in position, like calling on your team to like, hey, like help me use a peanut ball or change like my position within the bed, maybe rotating and using like
Hmm.
positions as a way to like help the baby descend. I think also kind of alongside that is just like pain medications in general and how, using pain medications can, you can start with a preference of like, I'm working
Hmm.
towards an unmedicated birth, or I'm working towards a birth with the option of XYZ medication. I've, talked about this with my provider. And then it's very common for people to go into their birth with like a set of preferences and a set of ideals that they would like in the best case scenario. But then, if things change and like birth is taking longer than they expected, or there's, an unexpected, complication, and it can even just be for the sake of like, we don't want anybody to suffer. There's a difference between like being uncomfortable and suffering. And so if we've like broached into that like space of suffering, like any, birth provider worth their salt is going to help you kind of address those needs and
Mm.
make a shift as needed in your, in your birth preferences. Um, and go ahead. I'm going to let Victoria add a little bit more to the pain medication piece before we move into the last one as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can say one thing, and then I think I have a kiddo who's home with pink eye who might need me really quickly. But one thing I would just say too is like I think often even like I'm really curious with my clients to get behind like what's behind that preference you have of no pain medication. Is it I don't want anything forced on me? Is it I want to be in control, of my body and my experience? Is it so I think some people, for example, I've noticed, some people say, I want a natural, right? We don't really use that word as much anymore. I want to unmedicate a birth. And what they're really wanting is like, I just want that feel of birth. Like I think I want the lights and the music and the chill and the calm. So if you can this work of digging into your birth plan, if you nail down, oh, well, that's what's important to you, that your birth feels like a birth. It may not necessarily be that there's no epidural involved. What you're saying, it's like, I just want this to be treated as like a physiologic, really important life experience, and it's honored by everyone on the team. We can do that no matter what's going on. And of course, for some people are going to have a strong preference. No, I actually really don't want the epidural or pain medication because I'm afraid of medicine. I'm afraid of side effects. I have a needle aversion. Um, Again, then you can work on the plan of like, well, how do we know if that changes? What do we do if that becomes necessary? How do we help you cope through it? But I think just getting down to the core of what people want is helpful.
Yeah,
Like, what are you actually
definitely.
asking for? But yeah, I will be right back too. You
Sounds
can
good.
keep
Sounds
going.
good. We'll talk through quickly. A third example of a birth plan working is with cervical exams. So I think just in general, doctors sometimes treat cervical exams as the holy grail, and they are to some extent an indication of if your labor is progressing as you wish. So they want to see changes. So there's when the cervix is dilating, it's either effacing or it's actually dilating open, and so they want to see some change in that, in the status of your cervix over time. And so the way that they check that is by doing a cervical exam. And they actually use like their fingers to like measure how many centimeters dilated you are. And if you're in, depending on the setting where you're at, there is going to be a strong preference of how often exams are done, or um, how, definitely how often, or how if they're done at all. And of course, you as the birthing person have the ability to veto anything that's done to your body. You may, have to have that conversation previously in your prenatal visits about, how often are these exams going to be expected to be done? Is there other alternatives if I'm clearly progressing in just like demeanor? And, is there a way that we can kind of work together to make this work? And then in the moment, you're always welcome to change your mind. So you can say, for the purposes of, avoiding infection, if my water's broken, I want to limit the number of cervical exams, or I just want, one cervical exam on admission and then, whatever I need after, because a lot of times they won't even admit you in a hospital until you're partially dilated, typically to like 4 or 5 centimeters, depending on the hospital, some of them a little bit earlier. Um, I'm always interested to hear kind of like what the like different policies are at different hospitals. I've heard as early as 3 and some of them are like closer to 5. So I'll let Victoria talk about that as well a little bit around cervical exams, especially since yeah, I'm just very interested to hear kind of like what the policies are around your spaces and what you're seeing.
Yeah, I would say similarly, I kind of see, some hospitals say like we have to do an exam to admit you, which again is kind of an interesting, like, well, you still have your own patient rights, like you don't have to consent to procedures. But I've seen that. I've seen like it's pretty typical to say on admission to admit you, we need to know what you're dilated. I guess unless you're just like, roaring in labor and people can obviously tell you're in labor. And interestingly, yeah, we also, again, it's a rule setting. We kind of have one hospital. I think, due to consumer, pushback against this, they're sort of assessing the policy, but there's a hospital who doesn't have 24-hour anesthesia, right? So they would say we have to do an exam to call the anesthesiologist to do an
Mhm.
epidural. And so again, it's sort of like that's kind of interesting, you know what I mean? Like um
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of where exams can get tricky, right? We kind of, and you may have said this too, I apologize if you did when I was off. But cervical exam, it's interesting that of these three options we're talking about, it's a procedure that gives us information, so we can do an exam if we're going to change a plan or make a plan based on that information. But if your plan is the same, like, well, I'm going to keep laboring, or I don't care if I'm 1 centimeter, I want an epidural, it should the exam be required. And again, helpfully, like I think part of the process of making a birth plan is, we'll talk about this in a second. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but it is establishing that trust relationship with your provider. You need to have a provider who's going to, you can take in their expertise, you can take in their knowledge and assessment of the situation, and also it should be a provider who really does believe in collaborative healthcare, and they're still going to honor what you're requesting, um, even if it may not be their own preference or it may not be right the hospital policy. Again, that epidural example is one that comes to mind, this one particular hospital, but I
Yeah.
know they're rethinking it because that's not really been a popular, like, well, hold on, we have to call, I have to do an exam before I call Jim Bob the anesthesiologist, like who lives 20 minutes away because he's not in house. It's like, well, does it matter if like I don't care what the exam is and I want an epidural? Um
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, it's just again, it's information. It can be helpful. It can be really helpful, especially if you need to make some decisions. But it's also
Yeah.
something that it's never information. We never want any part of a birth plan to be like held over someone's head, right? Because that's not consent to say you have to do this in order to get something else from me. And again, hopefully you have a wonderful provider who's going to be really collaborative with you and a wonderful healthcare team who's going to respect you. Um, but it can get
Yeah.
tricky in some circumstances. So
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's um with each individual, like it's completely fine as well if you want all of the exams and you feel more comfortable having
yes,
more than less.
sure,
I think on the
sure.
flip side of that, and everybody has their own like discomfort, thresholds that they're comfortable within.
Mhm,
And for different reasons, like everyone has different backgrounds and people may have certain triggers that just make it really
mhm,
difficult to have exams. It's really important that, just as with any other instance, like no means no. If you just say no, like it's very, very important
mhm,
that your provider respects your bodily autonomy and that you're working with a provider who you can have those
mhm,
discussions with ahead of time. But if it's also something that doesn't bother you at all and you prefer to kind of understand, I think it's helpful to know
mhm,
that like
mhm,
your cervix doesn't tell you everything. Like some people progress from, I've had clients that I've worked with who've progressed from 2 centimeters to 10 in 1 hour, and others that progress from
mhm,
4 to 5 centimeters over a period of 12 hours. And so there's a lot of
Yeah.
different things. It's not a crystal ball that just kind of tells you everything that you need to know or how quickly it's going to happen, but it can give you a kind
Mhm.
of a gauge over a period of time if there is progress or changes, which can
Mhm.
be encouraging or discouraging, kind of depending on how you
Yeah.
look at it and what where you're how you're
Yeah.
feeling in the middle of it, especially when you're in so much discomfort in the middle of labor. It's not a
Mhm.
particularly fun sensation. Some people consider it painful or a lot of pressure and all of those things, and it's just like prolonged. And so kind of finding your own, idea of where you might fall on the spectrum, having that discussion with your provider, but then always know it's completely okay if you change your mind in the moment. Even if you're saying, yes, and then you change your mind to no, or vice versa. All of
Right.
those are valid. And so the goal is that your provider is just like coming alongside you. Let's jump into what that looks like to actually build a collaborative birth provider relationship. So we have some
Mhm.
tips for communicating your birth preferences effectively and how to, communicate this with your provider in a way that's helpful and hopefully effective and will help you kind of like start to build that foundation for a really solid team for, your entire birth. So first of all, communicate early and often. Start that conversation with your
Mhm.
provider around where they sit on your, technocratic, humanistic, holistic
Mhm.
spectrum. Because if you both know where each other stands and you can make it clear where you sit and where your partner sits and what your preferences
Mhm.
are during your pregnancy, you can confirm that they support you in your preferences. And if there's, a ton of pushback and you're just really uncomfortable with that, you can always have the option to, switch providers if that's available to you. I know in some really rural areas, there's not as many like options as we would like
Yeah.
for folks to be able to, find a different provider that maybe fits better with
Mhm.
their philosophy. But it's helpful even, if you do end up staying with the same provider to just know where they sit on the preferences spectrum, so that you guys can communicate effectively. Yeah. Anything
Yeah,
to add to
I
that,
mean, I kind of
Victoria?
have a yeah, like I kind of have an anecdotal, do I feel like doulas are always sharing client stories to make points, but it's because we learn the most from our clients. But I had a client who, she had chosen a hospital-based midwife practice because she, and I would say she was highly holistic. Like she was like they didn't want a microwave, because like the waves are not good in her head. Like it was very holistic, like just very, very on the side. And she called me one day really upset after she said, I'm really upset. I had a terrible appointment. I need to talk to you. It's like, okay, well, sure, let's talk. She was just like very, very upset that this hospital based midwife practice didn't have a fetoscope. Like she was very upset when they pulled out the Doppler and check her baby's heart tones because she's like, I thought, she's saying, I thought you were a midwife. Like I thought you were going to be right in her mind more holistic. So and we talked about the difference between like a community based midwife, right, who might be practicing in a hospital or a birth center or a home birth setting versus like a hospital based midwife who's going to have more of those like right kind of tech tools science, it's kind of modern versus like a really holistic thing. But because she saw midwife, she was assuming all midwives were like very holistic, like we're going to have babies in the field, it's totally fine. um and so, I would say we discussed that. It was interesting to me, she still chose to stay with this hospital practice. But I would say she had a really difficult birth experience and just kind of process because it was kind of that constant battle of like, well, I wanted you to do it this way, but we're not, even though, we're trying to have these conversations of like, all midwives aren't holistic. There are some humanistic midwives and there are some holistic midwives, and you've chosen some humanistic midwives. So let's kind of meet in the middle. And for her, I know it was just kind of hard, right? Because like these are some deeply held practices for her, deeply held beliefs, you know, and it's like, um, it was helpful. Like that's honestly, that was one of the experiences that kind of made me start this conversation of having the philosophy talk, with yourself and your provider, just to know where you're coming from. Do I think the hospital midwives are wrong to not have a stethoscope? No. Do I think she was wrong to kind of be surprised if she thought all midwives were going to be like, like chacos, like hippie skirts, stethoscopes? No, it's just what she thought. But you have to just have that conversation of like, where are you coming from? Where am I coming from? And how do we meet in the middle? Um,
Yeah.
and so again, just knowing where you are, like, and for whatever reason for their family, homework was an option. So it's like, okay, well, there are midwives who might fit more with your holistic philosophy, but if you're choosing this, you just have to be prepared to not be shocked when your provider is behaving out of their philosophy and you're behaving out of yours. So I think it can kind of help. It can help diminish that shock, and it can actually help enhance your experience if you just know what you're walking into. We're not going
Yeah,
to be mad at anybody for being the truest version of themselves. But we can say, like, okay, well, how do we make these work together?
definitely. Yeah, for sure. And I think that just in general, understanding, the philosophy beforehand, not only like diminishing the shock, but also helps your provider
Mm,
understand where you're coming from if you do request something different than they might ask for. But also understanding what things they will, push back on based on like hospital policy. I think it's really helpful also to understand, when you're having that conversation with them, understanding if it's hospital policy or personal preference. Because some providers are basing, they're basing things off of experience or data that points that they may have. And some things are hospital policy. For example, some kind of more, I guess you could say, um, hospitals that haven't really moved into the modern era
mhm,
can
mhm.
tend to, have practices where it's like, okay, well, if your baby isn't born within 12 hours of arrival, we're going to schedule a C-section.
Right,
And those things are
right.
like hospital policy, but may not be the necessarily the philosophy of the actual provider. So it's helpful to kind of like have those conversations early on about like
Yeah.
what are hospital policies and is there anything that you're comfortable with me pushing back on? Is there anything that I need to do? Occasionally they'll say, okay, well, we're going to consent you to this, and you're going to sign a document saying that you're
Mhm.
going against our recommendation
Declining,
for
yeah.
their own. Yeah, you're declining.
Yeah.
And so, kind of understanding what that is going to look like on the day of can be really helpful because
Mhm,
you don't want to like
mhm.
find out information and kind of be reeling from things because the goal is that when you're in your
Yeah.
actual birth space, like the hormones aren't being disrupted by like adrenaline and fight or flight.
Mhm.
And when you're kind of in this like internal battle of like feeling like you're constantly fighting and pushing back on the day of and you're not able to just like kind of sink into
Yeah.
your birth, it can really affect like your overall satisfaction with the experience. And so this is where having a doula can really help because your doula has your back and can really just like help you communicate and be um, just be an echo for your preferences so that you're not the one who has to make requests and they'll verify with you and make sure that what you want is what's happening and be your advocate in that space. So
Yeah.
another thing that I would kind of like lean into for building a collaborative birth provider relationship is communicating within their scope of influence. So your medical provider is an incredible asset for navigating your choices and preferences on anything medical. So induction versus spontaneous labor, what your preferences are for pain medications or lack thereof, cervical exams or lack thereof, cord blood banking, etc. They're the go-to person for those medical things. So avoid filling your birth preferences with things that they can't influence. So for example, if you want dim twinkle lights and music and aromatherapy, add those to your birth preferences for your doula and your birth partner, but leave them off the birth preferences that you give your OB or midwife because they're not going to have as much influence. Your doula is going to be the one who does that. Your doctor is not going to be the one who's
Mhm.
hanging twinkle lights in your room. They're probably managing several different patients at the same time. And
Yeah.
so, and I'm sure if they had extra time and, whatever, they're just behind on charting and all those things. So your doula and your
Right.
partner are the people who are going to be able to influence those things.
Mm.
Anything to add to that, Victoria?
Yeah, I think, and then we didn't say this clearly too, but I tell my clients, like, write everything, like do one big like brain dump, onto a paper of like what's everything you want. Then when Amelia and I are saying like a one page birth plan, we're saying that's like what you're handing to the medical team. You might have like a 5 page birth plan of like, here's my thoughts and preferences and hopes and fears. That's really good for, again, partner, doula, any other support people you might have. But if we're thinking about like what do I hand in kind of to my provider, it should be that one page concise, and again exactly what they can control. I know there's a lot of good people who are doing work to kind of destigmatize birth plans. I think we kind of know. I know I've seen a nurse who's like rate rolled her eyes at a birth plan, that sort of thing. I really think the eye rolls, I think that stigma, it's unfair and it's wrong, but I think that comes from these really long birth plans where, right, a nurse is being handed like, I want low lights and don't talk and quiet, think like it seems high maintenance. It's not really. You're protecting, like, hey, this is how I'm going to feel safe bringing my baby into the world. And honestly, right, probably like this is how birth happens. It's a physiologic mammalian process, and we know mammals being quiet, dark, calm, cool, comfort, safety to have a baby. Um, so it's not high maintenance, but I think it can be perceived as such when like medical team who's just there, they're really just there to make sure you and your baby are safe and healthy. So when they're getting overloaded, I think that could be, that's my thought anyway. My philosophy is like, that could be where some of the stigma came from, as a nurse is like, I've got 5 patients. Exactly. Right. Like I have like, so much going on today. And really what the nurse needs to know is like, consent is really important to me, talking about everything before you do it. Don't, whatever, pain medication is often used. I don't really want pain medication unless I ask for it. I know it's here. You don't need to tell me about it. Just, I'll ask for it if I need it. Like, those are
Yeah.
things they control. And then what you control is really helpful for the rest of your team. And again, I'm hoping, again, there's lots of work, I think, to destigmatize birth planning. There's a lot of good people, both in the medical field and outside of it, helping us all understand like this is a communication tool. It's not like a bunch of high maintenance, right? Have you heard the term birthzilla? Have you heard that? I'm sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, it's like, it's not this birthzilla, bridezilla, right thing. I mean, then it's just, parents who are being thoughtful about their healthcare. And
Yeah.
again, really keen into that mammalian need for safety and comfort in birth.
Yeah.
But I think it can help remove the stigma if they just have the essentials, and then you get to control all the stuff, like you said, lights, smells, music,
Yeah.
hanging up affirmations, whatever is important to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also just kind of, pushing back on, I hate the term the business of birth, but it really is of just, like hospital systems are systems
Mm,
and they do operate within a
right,
very like corporate structure. And so
right.
when you're kind of doing something different than the typical corporate structure, it's very common for there to be, differences and opinions and philosophies. I think I've had as a doula really, really great luck with just being completely open and honest about what the preferences are. This kind
Mm,
of takes us to the
hmm.
perfect segue of the last piece of like seeing the humanity in your provider and being open and honest goes a long way. Just remember they're another human. They're going to have
Yeah,
their own preferences. They're
100%.
coming into your birth. They're also working within a system. And so, because they're working within a system, sometimes they're like limited in things that they can do. And so, just like being open and honest. I love this like snippet that you sent to me last night about even if it's
Mm,
calling out differences. So, saying, like, I know you'd rather do a cervical exam right now, but thank you for respecting my choice not to. Yeah, it's cheesy, but thank you notes and baskets
yeah.
do go a long way. Bringing in a box of donuts or fresh fruit
Mm.
or like snacks that people can grab from your room, and just like being really kind with the folks that you're working with. I think also I would add to this kind of list is like bringing your provider into collaboration and conversation in the moment as well. A lot of
Mm,
times it's hard to remember that, your provider, this may be their 10th birth of the day. They may be on the end of their shift or, in the thick of it. And there's just a lot of things going on. There's a lot of different people with a lot of different preferences in each different space. And
mhm,
so, you know, as a doula, I always like tell my clients like my work is to help that
mm,
provider remember that like even if this is their like 30th or 50th birth in the last several weeks, like for you and your family, this is your first birth, right? So this is your
mhm,
space and your, there's a lot of emotions that come in there. And sometimes like in the corporate structure of hospitals and stuff, sometimes the emotions can be kind of forgotten or, kind of set as
mm,
a backdrop. And so our work is to like bring that to the forefront. And, if we notice a
mhm,
provider doing something that's different than your preferences, confirming that you're okay with that and giving you the opportunity to say, like, hey, no, I don't want that. Or, yes, I do. And just kind of making sure that, everything that's happening, you're consenting to, and, just, bringing your provider into that conversation. So, not banning them from the room when there's a conversation going on about,
yeah,
what your preferences are, like involve them
mm,
in the conversation and invite them into that space to have, that conversation with you and ask them about the data points that they're coming from. Like, are you seeing something, you know, in my baby's heart
mhm,
rate that's concerning to you that makes you want to like move this forward, or is this just a hospital policy around time? And asking
mhm,
questions that are, open ended and
mm,
allows them the opportunity to come into conversation. Providers love that, and I think they respect it a lot as well. Just the ability to have that conversation and be a part of your birth space in that way.
yeah. I absolutely think so, and then, like, you kind of were hinting at that when you talked, but like hospitals are set up as technocratic systems. You know, it's very, if you had a hospital that was more like intentionally set up as humanistic, I feel like you would know that. But by and large, right, because it's a business, like in our medical institution, like medical system we have in America, they have to be for profit businesses, right now. And so it's just sort of acknowledging, again, acknowledging to the point where you're not going to be upset when you walk in and the hospital is behaving like a technocratic hospital would. um, and again, like, that's kind of why I've seen that call out. I've seen that work well. I've seen clients say like, I know this is not your typical, but if you can do this for me, that would be great. And it's important, right? That's a whole other conversation of hospital policy versus like your patient care. You always get to make decisions about your patient care. There are some hospital policies that any business has, right? Like you have to wear certain shoes. You're not going to put smoke in here because we have things that can blow up. Like there's policies, and then there's like your own personal healthcare decisions that you just always get to make. And it's going to be so much easier to make those decisions if you see everyone's as human around you. Like, see, I love how you put, I think you put that, the seeing the humanity in your provider, and just getting to know them and
Yeah.
humanizing it. And instead of walking in like this is a vilified person because they're different, walking in and saying, hey, you might be in residency and you're exhausted, you know, and again, you've done this a million times today. But it's my first, like, how do we slow it down? So again,
Yeah.
people kind of, the best of people are people at best, you know, and we are products of our environment. And so just slowing it down really goes a long way. I've seen it time and time again.
This will guide you through basically everything that we've talked through today and a little bit more. We've kind of like taken all of the bullet points and linked the technocratic, humanistic, and holistic paradigms of childbirth by Robbie Davis Floyd. And you can find the source for that if you want to kind of like go in and dig in a little more. And feel free to print this out and use this as a worksheet as well. I think it's really, really helpful if you kind of like have all of these things in front of you as you're sitting down to, build your own birth plan. So this will take you through, a couple questions like where do you fit? Where does your partner fit? And how are you going to handle like differences in approach if they exist with between you and your provider? And then we'll jump from there into a personal brainstorm that kind of like helps you kind of bring all of this together. So you're going to write a personal statement, and then we'll take you through the different pieces of labor and different preferences and where you might fit. So kind of knowing where you are on the spectrum and then coming into your actual preferences of labor, you can just make check marks and you can even copy and paste like this text or like type it up into a new document if it's helpful. Um, so if there's anything that you want to achieve, like what do you want? Do you want an unmedicated vaginal birth? Do you want a medicated vaginal with the option of opioids and epidural or anesthetics or nitrous oxide? Like what do you want? Do you want a scheduled labor induction? Do you want spontaneous labor? Scheduled cesarean? What do you want? Where do you kind of fit on that spectrum? And this can also change. I think it's really helpful to know that like even as you go, like your birth preferences, like even up to the day, as new information comes into your life can change. You could start out saying like, I want an unmedicated vaginal birth and then change that to like, I want a scheduled induction because now, I have new information. Maybe my blood pressure is high and there's a risk of like preeclampsia. And so like I'm going to adjust my preference here and I'm going to like move towards a scheduled induction. This is what I want from my induction. So maybe like even going in as deep as like, how do you want to be induced? How,
Mm.
some of that comes off of like there's some limitations. Like if your body's really favorable towards being induced, you could start with a Foley bulb and then from there move on into other like more medical Foley bulbs are very medical, but like more into the Pitocin route. And you can kind of like make like a plan about how the induction could potentially go. And had that conversation with your provider of like how you prefer to be induced. For example, like I had a client once again going into kind of like anecdotal client stories. A client who her doctor was wanting to do an induction with misoprostol, which is contraindicated for induction. There's actually like FDA notices put out about it. There's a lot of risks associated with it, and she was able to take that study. We printed it off, and she took a copy of the study to her provider and said, like, I don't feel comfortable with this. I would like this other option. And they were able to like use that as a conversation. So feel free to like get into the weeds with like what you're wanting and bring data to your provider if they're making a recommendation. Maybe they're uninformed. There's a lot of information, and it takes, unfortunately, a lot of time for things that are like proven and brought into evidence to be put into practice in a lot of institutions. And some learning hospitals will put them into practice sooner, but it can take like up to 20 years for something to go from data and a study and a clinical trial to common practice across the board. So just like be aware of that, if there's something that you're seeing, and definitely like keep in touch with your doula and those folks and talk to them about what's being presented to you, and they can provide you with like pros and cons and information and data sheets, and even like evidence-based birth, which we've linked to a couple of times in this guide, can help you kind of like understand the pros and cons of that. Any limits that you might have, or things that you want, for example, we put noise and light. If you'd like to reduce that, that may not be something that you put in there with your to send to your actual medical provider, but it can be something that you kind of like use as a reference point for your partner or your doula. For labor, if you like things that are access, there's also just any additional notes or just like thoughts you can use as kind of like a brain store dump. And then we've also like walked through, I think one of the like one very large kind of piece that is often misunderstood, is like the pros and cons of different pain medication options and what might be available to you. So we've kind of put some benefits of the pros and cons, benefits and risks of epidural, IV analgesics, or opioids that are used for managing pain through IV, and then also nitrous oxide, which is a slightly more like, I would say, less medication like option. There are still some
Yeah.
like cons to every option, but it's something that we're excited to definitely see as an alternative, especially for folks who don't necessarily prefer to have needles and things like that. It can be a great
Mhm.
alternative. um, and then also like we just walk you through pushing in birth and like different options for each of these different stages. If you'd like to have your partner help catch the baby, or have the baby immediately skin to skin, or do like cord clamping, letting them know that you would like to do cord blood and tissue banking if that's part
Mhm.
of your preferences, and you've got the kit from Anja. Make sure that that's in your birth preferences and that it's like labeled around the room so that they don't forget, because some of those things can be similar to any of this. If it's not common practice, it's easily forgotten. And so if it's something that's really important to you, like make sure you have that like clearly marked,
Mhm.
talk about it with your provider ahead of time, even if it's whether or not you want to have active third management of the third stage of labor, which is where you can go online and read
Mhm.
about the pros and cons of all of these things, or get that information from your doula on evidence-based birth. It's a great thing to know about and understand, especially if maybe someone in your family has a history of postpartum hemorrhage. It can be helpful to kind of know the data on that and what that looks like. Um, Make sure that they know that you'd like to take your placenta home if you'd like to, or if you're banking it. And then also around even sweet things, like delaying the routine procedures for an hour to enjoy that golden hour. Just kind of like reminders. A lot of hospitals I'm encouraged to see are kind of just practicing this in general. But occasionally, like there's a nurse who's just like, oh no, we're just going to do this really quickly, and you can say, oh no, we want to wait. And it's just,
Yeah.
it's just preferences. Different people have
Mhm.
different practices. And so we just sometimes have to remind people of what your preference is. If you plan to exclusively breastfeed or formula feed, that could be really helpful for them to know so that they can support you and bring in a lactation consultant or not. And then also, I think this is really important as well, is to talk about, the plan B moments.
Mhm.
So regardless of kind of if you're planning to have, an unmedicated vaginal birth, it can be really helpful
Mhm.
to have some preferences discussed around what would happen if your birth, preferences changed in the moment, some new information came into play and a cesarean was needed. What do you prefer for that space as well? Um, there's
Mhm.
a multitude of options available to you. And so really understanding them and knowing what to ask for. Different hospitals have different policies around cesarean birth just because it's a sterile field, and it's really important. And so sometimes they have policies around who can be in the room. Typically, if it's not an emergency, your partner and potentially your doula can be in the space, especially if your doula has a good relationship with the hospital. Sometimes um, I remember when I was working, like, it took a little bit of time to be able to, like, talk to them and say,
Mhm.
like, I would like to be in the room with my client and, like, support them, and just, like, building that relationship and building those bridges can go really, really as far as, like, having those face-to-face meetings, because a lot of times it's the charge nurse or the OB themselves making that decision, occasionally the anesthesiologist. And so if you have good
Mhm.
relation if your, doula has a good relationship with the hospital system, it can be helpful to know that by just, like, asking ahead of time, kind of like what they're if they have, that
Mhm.
information about which hospitals they're allowed in. Um, you can still have immediate skin to skin or breastfeed your baby during the repair stage of the surgery. And you can still have preferences about, if the baby has to go to the nursery or the NICU, like who accompanies them. And also, you could even put preferences. I don't think this is on here, but if you would like to be the first person to hold your baby, if you don't want, somebody else to have that first first snuggle, if that you'd like that to be you, you can request that, grandparents aren't in the room or something like that. So you can put all of those preferences
Mhm.
down onto paper, and just like ask for what you need.
I think one thing you hinted at that's really important is like by having this, like doing this work beforehand, and again, talking with your provider, like while you're still pregnant, you'll kind of know what's an option or not. Like when, the, like waiting, delaying newborn procedures for an hour. If that's standard at your hospital, great. Like you can take that off your birth, that saves you some room on your birth plan. Um, right. To say like,
Yeah,
hey, that's just already standard here. You can kind of really trim it down. If you know what's normal, like what's common, standard, what's not. And again, like thinking about really, I can definitely see where like an angina cord kit, stem cell kit would be like potentially lost in the room. Just a reminder too, this really is the work for like partner doula, whoever else is there. We're not saying like you need to be immediately postpartum, and remembering like, oh hey, don't throw away the stem cell kit. Like this is where working with a doula is super helpful, making sure your partner's really involved and knows your preferences, setting out those things ahead of time. And there's just some simple, like, I love bringing a copy of the birth plan with you and setting it, every labor and delivery room has like that computer nurse station. Set it right there, highlight what's important. Maybe you put the stem cell kit there with a big post-it note on it. Like, this is important, like, please bank whatever you're banking. It's just
yeah,
reminders that you're not, if you're making a birth plan, sometimes I see clients who think like they have to be the ones to remember all of this. It's like, no, that's what your team is for. And that's what this piece of paper is for. And put it up like wherever you need it, yeah, it's not to be picky, it's to help you communicate when you're not going to be probably able. Or again, right, we want you snuggling your new baby. We don't want you like remembering all these things. And just like the kindness goes a long way. Again, like the noise, if you want low lights and quiet, and the dietary person comes in and flips a light on, it's like, hey, how you doing? I brought your, clear liquids tray. Like it's okay to say, oh, sorry, we're trying to keep it really quiet. Just leave it at the door. Now next time, like I think we forget. It's like you're still allowed to talk to people. Like you can just correct people. Oh, sorry, quiet, no talking, or we want the lights off, or can you knock next time you come in? Um, Again, it's good to put on a birth plan, but again, kind of honoring the humanity in people. If someone forgets or just does it out of habit, you can just turn the light back off, say, she's having a contraction, and it's really doesn't, it can't wreck everything, right? Mistakes,
yeah,
little things like that, faux pas people might make, um, can't wreck your whole birth plan. Just be confident in what you want, and set it back to zero as quickly, your neutral as quickly as you can. And thanks to you guys for hosting this, and thanks to everyone who came for or watched the replay. Like, you're making space to think about your healthcare, think about welcoming your baby, which is really significant. How you enter parenthood, I think, is really a huge, it's going to you know set you up for
yeah,
success. Everything can be overcome, if it's not quite what we wanted or planned. But just by doing the work of being thoughtful and intentional, you're already kind of like really doing yourself, with your future self, a favor, and doing your family a favor. So thank yourself for like the time that you took to watch this and plan and be thoughtful. And also we talked some about the provider and like relationship with provider, relationship with nurses. I really want to encourage us to like it's easy to kind of sometimes look at what's difficult in American maternity care, but I think by doing this work, that's a small part of healing it too. So really, you're really literally part of kind of healing what can be sometimes a broken system or even just a busy system. May not be,
Yeah.
perhaps the hospital where you are isn't broken or, just totally missing the big points. They could just be busy. And so you're putting that humanity back into it by doing this work, and it's definitely making changes. So
Yeah, absolutely.